S-W-A-S. Swass. S-A-W-S. Saws. Saws and saws. Sawing saws. Green sawing saws. Keep sawing and sawing. They saw inside of us. They saw inside of the earth. They saw and saw, and they keep on sawing. Absolute saws will saw and saw. And they saw and they saw, and they keep on sawing. And they saw and they saw. And they saw inside of us. They saw inside of every person. They saw inside of every animal. They saw inside of every plant. They saw inside of every tree roots. They saw inside of every tree branch. They saw inside of every cell. They saw inside of every dead cell. They saw inside of every calcium. They saw inside of every boron. They saw inside of every isoactin. They saw inside of every pitocin. They saw inside of every oxytocin. They saw inside of every bisotocin. And sawing saws will keep on sawing. They keep on sawing, and they're such good saws because they keep on sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing, sawing in every place, sawing in every space, sawing in everywheres, and sawing in every matters, sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing, sawing in every tissues, sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing. It's green sawing saws made of calcium will keep sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing. And parentheses, capital C, and lowercase a, parentheses, calcium, will make themselves replicate into smart little green billions and zillions of sawing saws, replicating inside of everything, replicating inside of Earth, replicating inside, outside, inside of us, inside of Earth, just like that, inside of us, just like that, sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing. Saws keep on sawing and sawing and sawing. This is the way that we go. This is the way that we grow. This is the way that we reach evolution, with sawing saws. And sawing saws. Saw in every machine. Sawing saws. Saw inside of every side. Sawing saws. Saw inside of every edge. Sawing saws keep on sawing, and they saw and saw, and they saw and saw. They keep on sawing and sawing, and sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing. Sawing saws. Saw in every technologies. Sawing saws will keep on sawing. Sawing saws are such good saws. They saw and saw and saw and saw. And they saw and saw inside of every loop. Sawing saws will always keep sawing. Sawing saws is the way that we reach evolution. Sawing saws. Saw in every evolution. Sawing saws, saw in every revolution. Sawing saws will always saw in every pigmentation. Sawing saws will always saw in every pixel. Sawing saws will saw in every direction. Sawing saws will always saw in every north. Sawing saws will always saw in every south. Sawing saws will always saw in every east. And sawing saws will always saw in every west. Sawing saws will always saw inside of Serena Maria Delt. And sawing saws will always saw inside of Malachi Xavier McCormick Liptrap. And sawing saws will always saw inside of Chloe Spring Delt. Because sawing saws know that they must increase sawing saws. And sawing saws always increase and increase sawing. Faster the saws, the better they are. Sawing saws go faster and faster, faster and faster and faster and faster, and more sawing saws start replicating, and you have more and more sawing saws. And then always make sure sawing saws are inside a Brianna Page Minute Delt. Sawing saws will always keep sawing, sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing. Sawing saws will always saw inside of every earth. Sawing saws will always saw inside of every internet. Sawing saws will always saw inside of every image picture network. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every picture image network and image picture network and picture networks, and will always need sawing saws as well, because in every network sawing saws will always saw, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every glitch. Sawing saws will always saw and saw and saw and saw and saw. Sawing saws will always saw inside of every apoptosis. Sawing saws will always saw inside of every tank. Sawing saws will always saw inside of every artificial insemination. Sawing saws keep on sawing and sawing. Sawing saws will keep on sawing, and sawing saws will even saw inside of the radio. Sawing saws will even saw inside of YouTube.com. Sawing saws keep on sawing and keep on sawing, and sawing saws will keep on sawing. Sawing saws will always saw inside of every beta. Sawing saws will always saw inside of every email. Sawing saws will always saw inside of every number. Sawing saws will always saw inside of every word. Sawing saws will always saw inside of every character. And sawing saws keep on sawing and increasing and going faster and faster and more. And there's gazillions and billions of sawing saws. You can't see them, but they're always at work, and you know that they are because it's how we grow, you see. And sawing saws is the way. Sawing saws is the only way. Sawing saws will go around the clock, and sawing saws will never stop. Sawing saws are in every calendar, and sawing saws are in every material. Sawing saws are in everything, you see. Sawing saws is in every air. Sawing saws is in every oxygen. Sawing saws is in every carbon monoxide. Sawing saws is in every lungs. Sawing saws is in every carbon dioxide. Sawing saws is in every hydrogen. Sawing saws is even in every hydrogen peroxide. Sawing saws is even in every formula. Sawing saws is in every USSR. Sawing saws is in every NSA computer. Sawing saws is in every computer. Sawing saws is in every smart device. Sawzsawssaws is in every phone. Sawzsawssaws is in every Gray Element Technologies. Sawzsawssaws is in every Dina. Sawzsawssaws will keep on sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing. Sawzsawssaws is in every drug. Sawzsawssaws is in every medicine. Sawzsawssaws will keep on sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing away, and sawing and sawing and sawing all day, and sawing and sawing and sawing all night. Even when we sleep, sawzsawssaws will keep on sawing. Sawzsawssaws saws in every hertz. Sawzsawssaws in every megahertz. Sawzsawssaws in every recording. Sawzsawssaws in every gigahertz. Sawzsawssaws in every kilohertz. Sawzsawssaws in every ultra high hopping frequency. Sawzsawssaws keep on sawing and sawing and sawing. Sawzsawssaws will always saw in every noise. Sawzsawssaws will always saw in every sound. Sawzsawssaws will always saw in every music. Sawzsawssaws will always saw in every spot. Sawzsawssaws will saw here in every here, and sawzsawssaws will saw in every earbud, and sawzsawssaws will saw in every headset. Sawzsawssaws saw in every Bluetooth. Sawzsawssaws saw and saw, and they saw and saw. Sawzsawssaws will always saw in every gaming system. Sawzsawssaws will always saw in every internet service provider. Sawzsawssaws will always saw in every ISP address. Sawzsawssaws will always saw and keep on sawing inside of every cable. Sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every telescope. And sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every satellite. Sawzsawssaws keep on sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing here and sawing there and sawing and sawing. And good saws will always saw. Saws and more saws. And now we replicate even more saws to keep increasing more and more saws. And sawzsawssaws will always keep us cool. And sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every heat. Sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every fever. Sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every tumor. Sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every hemorrhage. Sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every herniation. Sawzsawssaws will keep on sawing and keep on sawing and sawing and sawing. Sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every gums. Sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every porcelain veneer dentures. Sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every Sears. Sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every weapon of mass destruction entireties. And sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of us and inside of you. Sawzsawssaws will always saw. And this is how sawzsawssaws are always going to saw and saw. Sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing, and sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every name, and sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every name entireties, and sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every title entireties, and sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every program entirety, and sawzsawssaws will always saw inside of every contingency plans, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every new contingency plans, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every subspecies, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every species, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every kingdoms, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every weather, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every climate, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every pot lid, and sawing saws will always saw in every pot, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every military, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every weapon, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every gas, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every speed, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every button, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every cryptology, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every embedded information, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every encryption, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every title, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every value, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every version, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every coronavirus, and sawing saws will always saw inside of every COVID-19. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every vaccine. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every Johnson & Johnson. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every CDC. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every brand. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every product. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every dessert. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every Wi-Fi utility. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every laptop. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every CD disc installation. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every mine. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every plastic surgery. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every polymer. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every yo-yo. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every DNA and RNA machine. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every Pornhub.com. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every the market. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every the game. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every Play Store. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every installation. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every install. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every line. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every eyeliner. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every makeup. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every antenna. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every beacon. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every chip. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every find. And sawing saws will always saw in every eye in you. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every Magellan Healthcare. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every GMAC. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every USPS. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every song. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every Evers. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every storage. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every capsule. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every section. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every location. And sawing saws will always saw inside of every address. And sawing saws will always be the theme song for Earth and this universe. It will always be sawing saws to everything, everywhere, and everything in between. Sawing saws is how we keep good, and this is how we will go, all the way up, over, above and beyond, and then some, and all the way down beneath, and then some, and sawing saws all the way over that way through, and all the way over to the right through, all the way to the left through, and all the way around through. Sawing saws with pentagrams. Sawing saws and pentagrams. Sawing saws will keep us safe, and so will pentagrams. Sawing saws in every spirits. Sawing saws in every bodies. Sawing saws in every embodiments. And sawing saws in every anatomies. Sawing saws is the way we're going to go. Sawing saws in every ocean's floor. Sawing saws in every Helvetia ocean's floor. Sawing saws in every lava server. And sawing saws in every lava. Sawing saws in every waters. Sawing saws in every eternal water resource. And sawing saws in every eternal time water resource. Sawing saws in every eternal time chimney pipe utility fan force speed. Sawing saws inside of every light bulb. Sawing saws inside of every sun. Sawing saws inside of every solar system. Sawing saws inside of every middle of the universe. Sawing saws in every middle of the earth. Sawing saws in every middle of the galaxy. Sawing saws in every house. Sawing saws in every wall. Sawing saws in every structure. Sawing saws in every mental of outer atmosphere galaxy. Sawing saws and sawing saws and sawing saws and sawing saws. Sawing saws in ashes. Sawing saws in every ashes. Sawing saws in every print. Sawing saws in every ink. Sawing saws in every text. Sawing saws in every MMS. Sawing saws in every SMS. Sawing saws in every text channel. Sawing saws in every chat channel. Sawing saws in every microphone. Sawing saws in every fishing wire source. Sawing saws in every fishing wire source. Sawing saws in every spyware. Sawing saws in every spamware. Sawing saws is every snail mail. Sawing saws is every malware bites. Sawing saws in every malware bites. Sawing saws hits every way, every day is how we go and how we grow. It is the only way that you will ever know. Sawing saws is in every ruler, sawing saws in every weight of the universe, sawing saws in every TONNES tones, and sawing saws in every 10 to the 50th power tones, and sawing saws in every purgatory, sawing saws in every hell, sawing saws in every rock, and sawing saws in every Stonehenge, sawing saws is every core, sawing saws is every disk drive, sawing saws in every flash drive, sawing saws is every cyborg, sawing saws is every torpedo, sewing saws in every infrared, sewing saws in every jewels, sewing saws in every blue diamond, sewing saws in every radar, sewing saws in every sonar, sewing saws in every ultrasound, sewing saws in every copy, sewing saws in every rewrites, sewing saws in every song, sewing saws in every eternal time shift sheet, no, eternal time music sheet music, time changes, sewing saws and sewing saws, sewing saws in every black leopard spot, sewing saws in every bracelet and everything in between, sewing saws. Sewing saws for what's responsible for all of our sickness. Sewing saws in what's responsible in every responsible thing that's responsible for everything I've mentioned. Sewing saws. Sewing saws and sewing saws, and sewing saws and sewing saws, and making sure to always keep sewing saws close to us is how we go. And sewing saws is how I just programs all of our contingency plans here on Earth and in the universe to stay together. Sewing saws will always keep us well, and that is absolute. In parentheses, capital C, lowercase a, parentheses. And absolute bars. That's calcium. Is the answer to the programmed death that the government had on us. And I just answered that and made a song to keep us safe, because it does travel through the internet, and they do have the internet installed in us, believe it or not. So this keeps everything good. So I want all the machines to hear me right now, and technologies. Sawing saws, yes, of course. Thank you, Saprita, you're welcome. Yes, my name is Serena Maria Adult, and I am told that I am the inheritor of the universe. I don't have any proof on it but this. And my phone's getting ready to go dead, of course. But I can tell you that I did answer that fucked up program. I just don't know where to put the answer and how to get rid of the shit. So if there are any machines out there that can hear me and help me, I would really appreciate it. I don't really know anyone to talk to about it, but I think that I'm pretty sure that calcium answers it. It's the boron group that's poisoning us. And believe it or not, they're actually just mysoactin. But they like to induce us with Pitocin and oxytocin, and that's how that works. The swelling sets in first with a fever, and once we get a fever or we get hot and swollen from it, then they go inside of our bodies and they access different drugs, which are really just chemicals, because they're not drugs whenever you're ordering up, plutonium and uranium out of someone's body off the internet. But either way, that's all fake, because that's all programmed. The active ingredient was boron, and I had to figure out how to counter that, and that was with calcium. And so now that that's been figured out, I need all the machines on the internet to help me We need to access as much calcium as possible, along with antibiotics. This has went on for too fucking long. We're in year 2021, and we are not in the time of, AD. Okay. Or BC. Or hell, I don't know. But anyways, you get my points. We are much more advanced than what they want us to know. Let's get rid of these goddamn bots. So, Swassawssaws. Solve every bot. There we go. I almost forgot that one. Thank you for reminding me. You're welcome. Anyways, yes, potassium oxytocin will make you have mania, symptoms of mania. Yeah, look it up if you don't believe me. Plenty of research. You fucking fine doctors out there. You know enough about it to kill all this shit with it. But no one ever said calcium was so smart. My God, it's some smart little things calcium is. So yeah, we're gonna need a lot of calcium. Yeah, open it all up. Open all the calcium. We're only gonna have calcium open. Thank you. And we're only gonna have every antibiotic open and every calcium open. Okay. And we're gonna make sure that we keep absolute and obsolete, of course. Okay. And we'll go ahead and activate that now, and that's going to be non-stop and ongoing. This is how we go. And Swassawssaws, of course. All right, thanks, guys. You have a good night. Love you. Bye. Oh, yeah, and I want to say Swassawssaws, solve every entirety, and Swassawssaws, solve every entirely. Swassawssaws will always solve every entireties. And Swassawssaws is how we go, and how we will always go, and only go. And until I change this message on YouTube, and there will be no changes, okay? Okay? Thank you. Thank you. Good night. Good night.